Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Scotland, where today we look at the long-term health impact of the pandemic, the impact on individual patients and the health impact on society as a whole. Our guest today, Professor Hugh Montgomery, is in a unique position to judge. He is Professor of Intensive Care at University College London and also practices as a consultant in Whittington Hospital. Today he has some harsh words for the UK's failure in public health, even with the National Health Service performing in exemplary fashion over acute care and the recent success of the vaccination programme. This interview coming up soon, but first to Tasmina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex, and another tremendous response to our show last week on the storming of the Capitol in the US. We, of course, featured Professor Wade Davis, who's a world-renowned anthropologist, to give us his views on the future of America. Kizzywiz says, really enjoyed that. I love the US and Americans, but their politicians are very scary. All empires eventually crumble, but never sure if the US influence in the world is good or bad. Great show as ever. Claudette says, seriously, can Biden revive himself? Never mind America. Paul Dunn says, Mr. Wade Davis uses eloquent language, but that doesn't make it true. He goes on to say, I've watched many Biden interviews where he contradicts his own words. Christopher Morris says, contradicting views that you've previously held is called changing your mind, not lying. Gordon McKenzie says, Professor Wade Davis is a fantastic guest. I've seen firsthand the divisions of race that still exist in the southern states. Maybe, just maybe, Biden can help cement a more tolerant society. Finally, I've got a lovely message from Vancouver, an email in fact. Hello Alex, says Ian McClellan. I watch your show on RT in Vancouver every week. It's refreshing to watch someone who knows how to interview his guest. Well done. As part of the Scottish diaspora, it's comforting to know that the intellect and common sense associated with our people is alive and well. Take care. Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian. And now over to Alex, who's interviewing Professor Hugh Montgomery, Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at University College London.
Professor Montgomery, it's a fair bet that very few people had heard of coronavirus just a year or so ago. Now just about everybody on the planet knows about it, but few still understand it. What exactly are these coronaviruses?
Well, it's a good question because most people would have known coronavirus, but they just wouldn't have known its name. So coronaviruses are a family of viruses, and they're so-called because they have a series of little spikes that come out from the surface, which gives it a sort of halo or crown effect. So the corona relates to the crown surrounding the virus. And they're quite common. 4 of them commonly affect humans, and we've all had them. They cause basically a little bit of a common cold. So snuffly nose, bit of a drippy nose, bit of a sore throat, slight cough, and really nothing more serious than that. Out in the animal kingdom, there are very many more of them. There are at least 5,200 we know about that affect other animals, but particularly mammals. And of course, we hadn't had any trouble until one of those seems to have jumped over from an animal into us. And we haven't been exposed to that before. And that's where all our problems come from.
So the 4 that have affected humans, have they been with us since the dawn of time, like the common cold, or did that originally come from the animal kingdom as well?
Well, it's hard to tell. Certainly viruses do cross over, but they've been with us for a very, very long time. That much is certain. But these viruses can cross over from animals to humans. I suppose if we think of the Spanish flu at the end of the First War, that was an avian or a bird flu that crossed over. Then we've had the bird flus of earlier this century, the early noughties. I suppose, of course, HIV was a crossover almost certainly from a simian immunodeficiency virus. So these things do cross over. They cross over much more commonly, though, if you degrade the environment in which those animals are living. So you kettle animals more and more closely together. You strip out some of the complexity of the ecosystem so they predate when they shouldn't. And then if you put a large number of people, big population densities nearby, much as we saw with Ebola and bats, and that crossing over as well. Now, whether this one jumped from that sort of thing, or whether it was meat markets and mixing animals up in the wrong places, or again, us eating things we shouldn't, we don't really know in this particular case where it came over. But from an animal, it certainly came. And the closest two variants genetically are bat and pangolin, which is a sort of scaly-looking, anteatery-looking type creature. The closest is the bat, but it's still about 3 to 4% different from the one that's infecting us. So there's still a question about whether it could have jumped from a bat, and looking at the mutation rate, that would have had to happen about 70 years ago, into another animal population, and it's that we got it from, and we don't know what that animal population is. So could well be some intermediary out there in which it's sitting, from which we caught it.
Now, would it be fair to say, Professor Montgomery, that even after just a year, we know more about this virus than just about any other, or have we still got lots to find out?
Well, we know a lot about a number of other viruses, of course, because we've had a very long time. But you're absolutely right. The learning curve for this has been absolutely staggering. If you think that the first cases were really being reported only 13 months ago, it took only a matter of weeks before we had the whole viral genome sequence out there. Overnight, people were coming up with the recipes that could be used in vaccines. And it is extraordinary that we've managed to get to so many effective vaccines implemented really from a standing start in less than 12 months from the beginning, without, and I emphasize that, without cutting corners. This isn't the vaccine to be knocked out in some shoddy, slightly dodgy way without proper testing. It's just that everything was focused on their appropriate development. And that is in itself quite extraordinary, isn't it?
And of course, this crossover between the animal kingdom and the virus has got very practical examples. I mean, the scare on the mink farms in Denmark in particular, but other European countries, is that a case in point of the dangers of accelerated mutation as a result of the closeness of animals to humans?
Spot on, and it absolutely is. So if you put very, 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 very large numbers of animals of one species close to other species that will jump over, but that kettling of huge numbers of animals together allows very rapid transmission between those animals. So you could think of poultry farms, but in this case, mink farms. So we got it from some animal, we don't know which yet, possibly the bat. This then got transmitted to mink in lots of mink farms in Europe, actually, but the big scares were in Denmark, where there were over 15 million mink kettled together for slaughter for their furs. And these are really just big vats in which this virus can breed, replicate, jump between animals and mutate. And when you've got that sort of situation, then, as happened in Denmark, a nasty version that's been brewed up there can jump back to humans. And so this was one particular version 5. And there was a really big scare and a big lockdown in Denmark, because if that one had got out, it would have been very dangerous to us and could perhaps have been partly resistant to the vaccine. So the animal kingdom teaches us a lot too about humans, and it's one of the key issues related to the mass vaccination and the lockdown. If you lift a lockdown too early, when you've got a very large number of people who could still get the virus, you have another large pool in which that mutation can continue to happen, and it might throw up a mutation that makes the vaccine less effective. So you really want to have got rid of the numbers and vaccinated nearly everybody before you take your foot off the pedal, because otherwise you could end up with a lot of people getting infected, a new variant appearing that then reinfects the people who've had a vaccine who are no longer adequately protected.
And Professor Montgomery, is it possible to put a number on that, of how many vaccinations have to be done before it would be reasonable and safe to ease the lockdown?
And by the conventional maths, we really are looking for at least 70% of the British adult population to have been vaccinated. And that's really important that we get there. And therefore very alarming when you hear these myths put out, everything from just insane conspiracy theories that you're being injected with microchips, or someone was telling me the other day you're actually injected with 4G. I'm not quite sure how you put an electromagnetic signal in a syringe, or that it hasn't been properly tested, or that it causes, the one I heard most recently, it causes infertility long term. None of these things are true. I'm not sure where the myths come from, but they're dangerous, because they're dangerous to the individual, but they're dangerous to us all if we don't get this level of vaccination up to where we need it to be.
And does that apply internationally as well, Professor Montgomery? I mean, they're saying that if this virus is anywhere, it could soon be everywhere again. And that pool of potential infectivity and variants and mutations Does that apply internationally as well as in this country?
Yes, it does. So this is one of the big worries. And the World Health Organization, you've heard the mantra, no one's safe until everyone is safe. And it's for exactly that reason, that if you leave a large pool of people amongst whom the virus is spreading, it can mutate and then can come back in, unless we become Fortress Britain and seal the borders and the ports and prevent anyone flying in, which is unlikely to happen. The question, though, which is raised, of course, is saying, well, this is very iniquitous, that we're vaccinating the British public and there's an awful lot of very poor people around the world. Shouldn't we be distributing the vaccine we've got to them? And the answer is, of course, we must be vaccinating everybody because that's for our own good. But equally, equitably distributing it right now would be pointless, because if you made 1 in 1,000 people immune in each country, or even 1 in 100, that would not in any way hamper the spread of the virus. So we do have to pick it off sector by sector. We're in Britain, we're lucky to be getting this vaccine. We just need all to get it on board. Will there be ones that will escape the vaccine? Yeah, they may well yet come down the line. This virus will continue to mutate. We have to hope it does it in the way that influenza does every year, where there's a slightly new mutation, which means we can catch it again. It's probably not too bad. We try and jinx the vaccine a little bit to protect us. We just have to hope that there isn't a sudden appearance of a real beast, for instance, that is much less responsive to the vaccine and much more dangerous. But that could happen.
Professor Montgomery, using your academic knowledge on the one hand and the practical experience in the intensive care wards on the other, is there a variant that you've seen worries you greatly in terms of treatment and the shape of things to come?
Well, the ones that's worried us really is just a harbinger for the future. So the Kent variants, the South African variants were the worry. They're not very much more lethal in themselves. They're just very much more highly transmissible. They do look as if they could be slightly more dangerous. For instance, the elderly age group that might have a 5% mortality, it might nudge it up to 6%. But the main issue is the transmissibility and the way it can infect. It looks as if most of the vaccines will respond, or the virus will respond to most of those vaccines. But the concern more is that it's raised a red flag of what might come down the pipe. We might get something that could evade the vaccine more readily, or something that would be very much more lethal. It showed there's a potential for this sort of mutation to happen.
Stay with us, because coming up after the break, we continue our discussion with Professor Hugh Montgomery and ask the key question: will coronavirus be ever with us? We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is continuing his discussion with Professor Hugh Montgomery, Chair of Intensive Care Medicine at the University College London.
We haven't heard so much about super spreading of late, which was very much in vogue at the start of the pandemic. Well, what exactly is super spreading? Is that about an individual and their genetic makeup, or is it about the lifestyle? Is it kind of nature or nurture?
It's a very good question, and everything in life is nearly everything in life is a balance between nature and nurture. So, for instance, if we look at could a young child, could an 8-year-old be a super spreader? No, pretty hard. They don't really contract the virus very readily. They don't have a really huge viral burden as far as we can tell. So whilst they could be a super spreader by the fact that they play with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people and see lots and lots of relatives, they'd be potentially at a slightly lower risk. If you were someone of my age, approaching 60, and being male, I could get hit with this virus very badly. And for maybe 40 to 50 hours before symptoms and for several days afterwards, I'm highly infectious. Now, the question then is, am I a super spreader? Well, for that, it depends entirely on my behaviour. If I live like a hermit in a cave in the north of Scotland, I can't infect anybody at all. And I do live a bit like that, as we all do at the moment. I don't socialise, I don't mix with people, I cycle to work. I can't be a super spreader because I just don't get in contact with people. And when I'm in the hospital, I'm wearing a mask, as we all should. The situations where you put yourself when you're infectious, and bear in mind, half the people who are infected don't know they're infectious, they haven't got any significant symptoms. If they go and spend a prolonged period of time, let's say a few hours, in a confined space, let's think a pub or a restaurant or a bar, with poor ventilation, let's think of those sorts of places as well. So they're indoors, it's cold, the windows are going to be shut. and everyone's having to talk or shout loudly, which we all have to do in pubs and bars, then you're coughing or you're shouting or you're singing along with the rugby or whatever it might be. So if you cram 100 people in for a big birthday celebration in a poorly ventilated bar where everyone else is not immune, one person could potentially infect 40 to 80 people.
Professor Montgomery, can we turn from the academic study of this developing virus, this developing threat, to your practical experience and personal experience in the intensive care wards in London? How has the treatment of people with COVID being improved over the last year, and has that made a big difference?
Well, it has. So if I think back to the first patients we started seeing, which was about a year ago in the February, this disease was new to us. We'd never seen anything like it before. We thought we were going to get patients that sort of had a bit of bad flu in terms of their lungs. And we're used to ventilating people with bad lungs, with flu. And sadly, a lot of those people will die every year. It became quickly clear that one of the big problems with the low oxygen levels were actually blood vessels. Something was going badly wrong with those. We quickly learned that blood clots were forming in patients and killing them. We found that kidneys went down. We'd normally run patients a bit dry in terms of fluids. We tried to restrict the amount of fluids. That seemed to make things worse in the early stages. So we had to do an awful lot of learning. And a lot of that was literally phoning each other up saying, I've seen this, have you seen this? Have you seen that? We had Zoom calls every week nationally with people literally just to trade information to say, I've seen a few of these too. Is that a real thing or is that not? And we did it internationally as well. It then moved on as we learned from sharing our knowledge and practical experience into the trial platforms. And Britain has really led the world in this. Thank goodness we have a National Health Service and we have a National Institute for Health Research, which swung into action really quickly and stopped people just doing their own personal little treatments and trials of 10 people, and basically said, everyone that's out there, we need to try to get them into trials. And that's where you've seen these breakthroughs come from. They've really pretty much all come from Britain, because we've actually been having big studies. There's been a study called Genomic of the genetics, one called REMAP-CAP, which is an international study, actually, not just British, but we've recruited heavily here for it, and another called the Recovery Trial. And they've given us the first treatments that really seem to benefit. So the first that you'll remember being announced was steroids. Steroid treatments make things a bit worse, actually, if you don't have bad disease. But if you're bad enough to be in a hospital and need oxygen, they do significantly reduce mortality. So the data there were pretty dramatic. At that point, the death rate was around 41% in hospital, and the mortality rate was reduced to a little under 30%, so 29% with steroids. So now if you come into hospital, you're given this cheap, few pounds a day steroid for about 10 days. We've now got other answers. There was a drug called remdesivir, which is an antiviral agent that may have some impact. But last week, this drug called tocilizumab, which is an anti-inflammatory drug used actually in arthritis, but was thought may have a role for various reasons in this disease. And so it appears. The mortality rate looking at people, these are people with quite low oxygen levels and inflammation, so a slightly different group in the DEX. You can save about 5 lives for every 100 people you treat. That's the similar sorts of number for dexamethasone. So these things aren't total game changers, but they are making a difference when added together. Now, the mortality rates this time round are lower, is around a 32.8% mortality in intensive care. Of course, more people across the board dying, but if you hit intensive care, we're now down to that sort of level, around 32%. There are 17% patients still in intensive care from that cohort. So the number's likely to go up a bit, I should think. But that's much better than we were getting in wave 1, which was north of 42%. But then things are changing too. We didn't know what to do with the lungs to start with. We now put tight-fitting masks on, which provide some extra pressure. And that seems to have made quite a big difference to stopping a lot of people requiring a mechanical ventilator to go onto a breathing machine. And it's just as well we worked that out in wave 1, because we wouldn't in any way have coped with this wave if everyone had to go onto a breathing machine. We wouldn't have managed it at all. You know, for every one person on a ventilator, we had tens of people on this other form of support on the wards. You asked a little bit about what it's like with that. It has been brutal. And I know people see these pictures on the news in the evenings of what it's like. But remember that you can't train up intensive care doctors and nurses. The number we've got now is pretty much the number we had a year ago. And in fact, in this wave, we've had fewer because people have had to self-isolate, homeschool, been off sick with coronavirus themselves. And so you've ended up with the same number of trained intensive care nurses and doctors as a year ago, but looking after the equivalent of an extra 126 intensive care units of patients, doing well over an extra 1 million hours of work a week. It's that level of workload. I think that sums it up perhaps a little bit more clearly. So it's been very wearing. The hours have been long for everyone, and it's been emotionally a long and hard journey for everyone in this last year.
And what do we know now about so-called long COVID? Have we got an assessment of the debilitating effects that this disease can have on those who have been seriously ill?
It's a very good question. So what do we know? We know it's real. So this was a disease, oddly enough, that probably the first disease for quite a while that patients defined for themselves. Because, of course, in hospitals, we weren't seeing it. But clusters of patients on social media started saying to each other, hang on, I'm not right. This disease, we're told, gets better in 3 weeks, and I'm still ill. We know that some people have severe lung scarring, some have progressive infection, some have a thing called an organizing pneumonia, where the lungs progressively get in trouble. Some will have blood clots. We know that in some women, there's reports, mainly in the social media, but I believe them to be true, of early menopause and quite significant menstrual cycle disturbances. And worryingly, although we don't have any data yet, the protein the virus binds to is most strongly expressed in men in testes, in sperm-producing cells and testosterone-producing cells. So it's possible that part of this might be due to testosterone effects. Finally, we're getting some signals that something's gone very badly wrong with energy generation in cells. And we think this might be due to an impact on these thing called mitochondria, which are the little power stations inside cells. And it looks as if they might have got damaged in some people too, which would account for why they walk a couple of 100 meters and feel like they've just run for the bus, that they're absolutely exhausted when they do that. So we're trying to get the research off the ground at the moment, and others are doing the same, to try to, what we would call phenotype these people, try to work out, is this a one thing? I doubt it's one thing. I suspect it's a lot of things. And what are the mechanisms behind those lots of things? And from that, find out, is it going to get better on its own, or do we need a treatment for it to improve it? But certainly, if anyone knows someone with long COVID, they do deserve your sympathy, because this is a real disease.
So how do we explain this apparent paradox where a National Health Service deals with acute care in an exemplary and tremendous fashion, where the vaccination programme is going extremely well in international terms across the health services of the administrations of the UK, and yet as a society in health terms, our public health was unable to control the disease, and as a result, the UK is one of the highest fatality rates in the world.
Well, you're absolutely right on this. And this is a wake-up call to us about public health. And there's a lesson here about embedding equality, addressing poverty, and trying to deal with public health, as you so rightly put, to try to make it the seed bed here that could nurture viruses of this sort will be less of a problem. Because we are, a lot of the people we see in hospitals have an obesity problem or are significantly overweight. A lot of them live in housing where they can't avoid other people and so forth. So we do need to, having spent years cutting public health, we need to reinvest in it. And we also actually have to think a little bit too about how we want to recover, in my view, as a society from this virus, because we can go back to the environmental degradation that's causing climate change, as well as the potentially allowing these sorts of events to happen again, and the farming practices. We can go back to 142 people a second boarding a jet plane, which is what was happening just before COVID happened, and that's what spread it around the entire world. And we can have an economy that is built on pubs and hospitality. And I've got nothing against going to the pub or hospitality. I do that myself as often as I can. But is that how we want to recover our economy or not? We have to think a little bit differently, I think, about what we want to go on in the future now.
And finally, somebody who got their jag this morning and feeling good for it, and I know that you invented the fitness gene. How soon, Professor Montgomery, will it be before I can get a jag for fitness as well as to prevent COVID?
Well, wouldn't that be a lovely thing? I'd be first in line if I got that one. Yeah, we found the first gene affecting human fitness. But it's much as you say, really. Everything is genes and environment. You have to play the hand you've been dealt. And everyone can find some sort of exercise they enjoy. The most dangerous form of exercise I've ever engaged in is Scottish dancing. I mean, that still seems to me to be utterly lethal. Swinging each other around by the arms, great fun. But you don't want me on a dance floor.
Well, we both look forward to a time when all of us will be able to engage in that sort of activity again. Professor Hugh Montgomery, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Hugh Montgomery is in a unique position to tell us about this pandemic. A brilliant academic physician, he's the man who discovered the fitness gene. Nobody can tell us more about the genome of coronavirus. But he also mans the wards in intensive care. He says on a daily basis the impact of this virus on human lives. And therefore, when he tells us that our public health measures need some attention, that we have allowed this pandemic to get a grip of society, then we should listen. Just as we should listen when he tells us that if this virus is anywhere, it's everywhere. And that is why total vaccination in the countries of the United Kingdom is very sensible, but it's not enough. This virus has to be eliminated everywhere, otherwise it will come back to bite us. And that reservoir of mutations will threaten humankind for generations to come. It may be that we're going to have to get used to the thought that COVID, like the poor, are ever with us. But that doesn't mean that we've got to accept the situation as inevitable. And messages like the ones we've heard today bring it home how vital this struggle is, that it is not over by a long shot, and there is no room for any sort of complacency, that it's going to be plain sailing from now in. And so for Tasmina and myself and all at the show, stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.